Hello, sports fans, and welcome back to Ball Games and Beyond. I am your host, Evan Grote. And as always, Ball Games and Beyond is brought to you by Sportsnaut.com. Please go out there and follow us on our YouTube channel, subscribe, and click that notifications bell as well. And you can listen to the audio version of the podcast by searching Ball Games and Beyond on your very favorite podcasting platform. I want to wish everyone out there a happy Memorial Day weekend. Make sure you take a minute to reflect this weekend on all of the great heroes out there who have served this country and lost their lives, giving the ultimate sacrifice and defending this country. So make sure you take a moment out there to do that. Now, for the show this week, NFL is going to be the direction that we go in. OTAs, off-season training activities got underway for the majority of the teams in the league this year, and so I was doing some reading on that, trying to get caught up with what's going on around the league. And I saw an article this week on The Athletic by Randy Mueller, who will be our guest this week. Randy is a former NFL general manager. He has spent 35 years in the NFL. He was the general manager for the New Orleans Saints, as well as the Miami Dolphins. He was the 2000 Executive of the Year in the NFL. So this is a guy who knows what he's talking about when it comes to roster management in the NFL. He's also the co-host of the Football General Manager podcast for The Athletic, and he's a staff writer for them as well. But he has a story out this week, and the title of that story is, has the wide receiver market reached a breaking point, and how much is too much for an NFL wide receiver? Currently, we have wide receivers in the NFL making over $30 million. A.J. Brown is the league's highest paid wide receiver at $32 million. And Amon-Ra St. Brown just got a new contract this offseason for $30 million. So that certainly makes building a roster very, very challenging when you have wide receivers now taking up 12, 13% of the salary cap. Now, we know the salary cap is increasing every year. It's up to $255 million this year. But what Randy explores in his article is how much is too much for a wide receiver. And he also takes a look at some of the creative alternatives and options that teams may have to take in order to battle the rising costs in a wide receiver and whether or not it's even worth it. So that is the topic for today's show. We're going to bring Randy in now just after I get back from this quick break. So you don't want to miss that conversation. All of that and more coming up on this week's edition of Ball Games and Beyond, brought to you by Sportsnaut.com. And welcome back to Ball Games and Beyond. And this week we are joined by former NFL general manager Randy Mueller, who spent some time with the Saints as a general manager, as well as the Miami Dolphins during his 35 years in the NFL. And now he does work for The Athletic as a staff writer. He's also the co-host of the Football General Manager podcast on the Athletic Podcast Network. So, Randy, we are happy to have you joining us here on this Memorial Day weekend.
My pleasure. It's good to be with you. Always good to talk football in the summertime.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the season getting started here in a few months here. I recently saw a story that you wrote on The Athletic. It caught my attention. I thought it was very interesting. You took a deep dive and looked at the wide receiver market and questioned, is it at a boiling point here, at a crossroads, and how much is too much for a wide receiver? We're now seeing the league's highest paid wide receiver making $32 million per season. And you question whether or not that's a model that's sustainable for all teams. And you also took a look at some of the creative alternatives that teams may have to do in order to make it work for their roster. But before we get into more details of your piece, I saw you tweeted this out. I saw when you quote tweeted your story out. You had the words, building a team is much different than player evaluation. Could you just explain to us how that comment relates to this specific topic of wide receivers in the market and how the costs are getting so outrageous? Just kind of explain to us what that means?
Well, I think it's definitely a different criteria that one uses to evaluate as opposed to build your team. And having been a GM in the NFL a couple times, I think what people probably understand least about a GM's job is that you're trying to build a team of 53 players. Not only that, but you've got another staff of 20 in coaches. And so you're putting together a lot of dynamics, and you've got to determine a pay scale to how you want to divide up the pie. It's a matter of allocating resources, and everybody probably has an opinion on how they best think you can use your money to build a team. But we have a lot of people in our world today, and I get it, that want to evaluate specific players. The draft has become its own industry, right? And there are many things that have spun off from that. But I think the difference is we have a lot of people who can evaluate talent, or a lot that do. And that's an individual in a test tube type evaluation of a particular player. What I'm saying is when you got to put 53 of these test tubes together, that's when the team building aspect comes into play. And that's all I was trying to say is I'm not devaluing any of the receivers or the individuals that are involved in this at all, because they're all really good players. It's just a matter of how you allocate resources, that's all, to put it all together to give you the best chance to win.
Yeah, well said. I thought it made a lot of sense to me. One of the things you point out in your piece is that when players get too expensive, nothing speaks louder than looking for cheaper alternatives and cheaper options. And I think we saw that in many cases this past year in the NFL draft. We saw a record number of players getting selected in round one. And if you think back just the last couple of seasons, we saw some really, really talented wide receivers get traded. I'm talking about Tyreek Hill. I'm talking about A.J. Brown, Devontae Adams. All of those players are still at the top of the league in terms of production, but they were also looking for bigger contracts. And again, these are some of the decisions. Oh, and another one we just saw more recently was Stephon Diggs. I got to throw him in there as well. And, these are some of the decisions that you talked about. When you're talking about building a roster, these are the decisions that general managers are being faced with. And I don't think most NFL fans understand that. So I'm glad you pointed that out to us just a minute ago. But just talk to us about some of the different routes that and some of the creativity that general managers now have to look at when trying to battle the cost of the rising wide receiver market.
Yeah, you definitely have to find creativity within your team build. And I've always said this for years. I think that you've got to give yourself options. And you mentioned that off the top. I think what made me go down this somewhat of a rabbit hole is the fact that when you start writing checks as a GM for non-quarterbacks in that $30 million range, it really forces you to be creative, to find other ways. Because what we see happen is these teams, some teams, like you mentioned, have decided to fill their wide receiver room with maybe 4 or 5 quality guys, but no stars per se. And they're not out to not look for stars purposely. They're just finding a way to put together a comparable group. Other places are adding that one key element of a Tyreek Hill or a Devontae Adams or somebody that's going to, they feel, put them over the top. It's the sustainability that I think will be a struggle in when you have to pay a second guy. Or a third guy. And that's what makes it really hard and then my point also is that it makes it really hard if you don't have that wide receiver one, to use the fantasy term, and it's got to be a special guy to create that box of paying him $30 million. So it's one quality star versus maybe 2 or 3 at a more reasonable number, but yet get you over the hump and allow your team build to still be successful from the wide receiver room. Now, it's easy to take the route, like I should say nothing's easy, but it's easier if you're a Buffalo moving on from Diggs or a Kansas City moving on from Tyreek Hill because you've got such a great quarterback. That's really the first pushback we get on the outside world as well. They got Pat Mahomes, so they can do whatever they want. To a point, that does give you a longer leash, but I think what it also does is it gives you flexibility throughout the rest of your locker room when you don't have to, like, for example, Philly did with A.J. Brown, guarantee $50 million in his deal. It's the guarantees that then when you dive a little deeper in to see how those rooms are structured, the guarantees give you less flexibility to build out the rest of your team. And all I was trying to do is do an exercise which continues to give you flexibility in roster building.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Allen and Mahomes because certainly they make it look easy. I think maybe we're even seeing the Chargers in Los Angeles maybe try to follow that same model with Justin Herbert as they moved on from Keenan Allen and Mike Williams this offseason as well. So I guess that brings the question that I want to ask, is it necessary to have that stud wide receiver or how important is the wide receiver market when you have that stud quarterback? Is the quarterback what makes the receiver, or the receiver that makes the quarterback, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It kind of comes down to the chicken and the egg theory, right? I mean, we're all looking for a great quarterback, and that just does give, in my opinion, it gives us more margin for error. Hey, we saw in New England for 20 years a group of, for the most part, average receivers and really talent around Tom Brady. He gave them, in my opinion, a license to really do whatever they want with the rest of that roster and build it specifically for what their schemes wanted to do. So I do think that's the issue. I'm always for, and I started the column by saying I'm always for not letting good players go. So that's not the basis behind why I do this, because they're so expensive. All I'm trying to do is find different ways, like you say, to be creative within your deal making and team build that still gives you a chance to be successful. I think you always are looking for the best players you can get. And then it's a matter of managing those resources within to keep them for as long as you can. I just don't think you can, in this day and age, because of where the money has gotten, write these checks or guarantee or maybe come up with an average per year above that $30 million. That's when I think you got to be creative.
We are joined this week on Ball Games and Beyond with former NFL general manager Randy Mueller, who does some work now for The Athletic. He's got a great story up right now on the rising costs of the NFL wide receiver and whether or not it's, how much is enough or how much is too much, I should say. On the flip side of that kind of conversation that we were just having about whether or not it's necessary to have that number one stud wide receiver, you look at the situation in Minnesota. They just drafted J.J. McCarthy, and they also have Justin Jefferson, who is arguably the top wide receiver in the NFL, who is going to reset the market most likely when he gets his new contract. He's only 24 years old. He's just entering the prime of his career. We saw what happened to last year's number one pick, Bryce Young in Carolina, who struggled badly without a top wide receiver. And there were several other reasons why that offense struggled as well, but definitely one of the glaring needs there was at wide receiver one. How much pressure does that put on a general manager to have to go out there and pay big money to a guy like Justin Jefferson when you know the benefits that it could have on your rookie quarterback like J.J. McCarthy?
Well, I think what you're saying alludes back to your earlier question. I always think the quarterback is what makes the receivers. I don't think you can add receivers that are going to elevate necessarily the quarterback's play. That's just my opinion. I don't know. I think Jefferson's the best in the league, so I think he's really good. I'm not for the Vikings letting him walk out the door. I just think what you're going to have to do is you're probably going to have to pay him and then manage the rest of that room to still be effective. And now you mentioned some of the options that teams might have. In their case, they've done two things. They've added a longer-term quarterback, which sounds like J.J. McCarthy is that guy. But they just drafted Addison, the receiver from USC, a year ago, out in the first round. So he is another option, and I think I mentioned this in the column. Maybe this is the ideal world, is you pay a top guy and you continue to rotate that second guy. And if it happens to be with a first-round receiver every 4 or 5 years, so be it. But you've at least been able to control your costs somewhat and give yourself a chance going forward to build out the rest of your team. But I think in this game today, as we sit here in 2024, it is definitely a passing game. You've got to find ways to, one, keep the quarterback upright, and two, move the ball downfield in a fashion of throwing the football. So I think that for alone lends itself to having to pay receivers more than traditionally has been the market for that room. So you're going to have to adjust a little bit. You mentioned it earlier, 7 wide receivers picked in the first round this year. That's That's a rare number. And teams, I think, did that with one eye on positioning themselves to build that room out for the foreseeable future. Maybe that's the answer, is they keep drafting receivers early, hoping to find one that is a legitimate number 2 guy for 4 or 5 years, and maybe that guy eventually does become the number 1. But it's a thing. Let's just put it that way. In summary, it is a thing to manage this receiver room from a contractual standpoint.
Yeah, and one of the things I don't think is being talked about enough is, as it relates to this conversation is, it's one thing to pay a high-end elite talent like Tyreek Hill or A.J. Brown or Devontae Adams. Those guys are worth the money if you're going to give it to them. But what we're seeing is a rise in the cost in like the tier 2 range for a wide receiver 2. I looked at the list of highest paid wide receivers, and in that 12 to 20 range, you have guys like Brandon Cooks, who's making just under $20 million. You have Deontay Johnson, who is making $18.4 million. Jerry Jeudy just got a new deal from the Browns, $17.4 million. Between Johnson and Jeudy combined over 9 seasons, they have one 1,000-yard season. So as the cost for a wide receiver 1 rises, it's also bringing up the cost for your tier 2 and tier 3 wide receivers, which makes things especially challenging for general managers as you're trying to build out that roster. What's some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you definitely have to be able to value the players that you have. And you mentioned some guys that, frankly, I think the receiver position as an evaluator, it's one that I can churn. It's one I can find players. There are a lot of receivers. I think that if you can find the scheme fit that makes sense, that you can sign for value purposes. And the guys you mentioned are pretty high value for the production that they've shown to this date. The same thing can be said for making one of these guys a $30 million player. We saw Detroit do that with Amon St. Brown, who I think around the league, the conversation probably was more about him than A.J. Brown getting his deal redone and taken to $32 million. I think the St. Brown contract raised eyebrows from the standpoint of, is this guy a top 10 receiver? Maybe not, but he's a good player that they're paying great because he fits really good with them. I can see both sides of that coin. Again, it depends who you ask if you're getting value out of some of these players. I just think, and this year was maybe an anomaly. We said 7 guys picked in the first round. There were a lot of really good ones, so I'm not devaluing what those guys were. I just think it's a position where you can find value so that you don't have to pay maybe that second guy, like the numbers you mentioned, $20 million. You don't have to pay that kind of money as well. Maybe that the discrepancy between your top guy and your second guy, maybe it's the middle guy that gets cut out. I don't know. I just think it's an interesting dynamic that GMs are conversing around the league.
Do you think it's possible? Because when I think about the running back market and what we've seen happen there at that position. Now, I know that's a position where there's a little bit more wear and tear to the position just because of the amount of hits that they're taking and the high impact, and receivers just don't see that type of impact, I guess I would say, as the running back does. We've seen that market kind of, undervalued, I guess, and teams not giving out the money to the running back, looking to pick up a guy in the 3rd or 4th round to do the job. Do you think that's something we could maybe see happen at wide receiver? Is teams just say, you know what, we're not going to pay that top dollar and we're going to try to get by with a little bit less here?
Oh, I think that's definitely in the cards. I think it's, again, GMs are looking just like I did with the column. They're looking for any option they can so that they don't have to guarantee 50% of a $30 million a year deal like Philly did with A.J. Brown. So definitely. I also think the other ways to look at it are when you pay a receiver, and maybe it is 2 or at least 1.5, you've got to get that money from somewhere. So you may see the continued devalue of running back, and I think we saw some of it this offseason with safety position. Teams have kind of paired some of those dollars as well, and maybe those become corner and receiver dollars. And so, again, it's just repositioning your resources as to how you dole out your cap.
Yeah, Randy, thank you so much for all the time. We're going to get you out of here on this one. One of the more interesting situations as I look around the league who have a receiver that is going to be looking to get paid here, I think Dallas is one of the more intriguing situations. CeeDee Lamb, who is due for a new contract after this season. They also have Dak Prescott, who is going to be up for a new contract as well. Dak's currently making $55 million. Dallas has been good with Dak, but they haven't taken the next step that they're looking to take to get to, make a deep playoff run, get to a Super Bowl. How do you see that situation playing out? Or maybe if you were the general manager in Dallas, how would you go about trying to address the position, that they're in with Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb both being up for a new contract after this season?
Well, I would say this. I would always prioritize the quarterback. I think that's the hardest thing to find and to come by. They've kind of, rubbed salt in their own wound over the years with Dak because of the way they've strung out the contract, and really now are really hostages of the situation they've created, because Dak has all the leverage, as we all know. His deal expires. He has a no tag clause, can't be traded. He has all the leverage, so he's going to get paid. If he wants to leave, he can. That's a dilemma that I would not want to face as a GM. But I would always prioritize the quarterback position. Again, and I'm not for letting CeeDee Lamb walk. That's not what I'm saying. I think you've got to pick your poison with what kind of a deal you structure with that number one receiver. And then it could be that the Brandon Cooks and some of the other ones take the fallout from what you have to pay. I think first I'd take care of Dak. Next I'd take care of the receiver and kind of see where we fall. They paid their right tackle, Terrence Steele, last year during the season an average of over $15 million a year. That one surprised me just because I was looking to save some money down the road to take care of these guys. You're going to have to do with less at other positions because of of what it's going to take to sign Dak and CD as well. So, hey, welcome to being a GM in 2024. This is all part of the equation that sometimes it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's just the way it is.
Absolutely. Not a job that I would want for sure. Randy Mueller, everyone, thank you so much for the time. You can follow Randy on X at Randy Mueller _. You can also check him out on the Athletics podcast, the GM Football podcast, and you can follow his work, his written work on the Athletic as well. Randy, thank you so much for the time, and have a happy Memorial Day weekend.
Thanks, Evan. You too.